Hello, everyone. This is, sorry about that. Let me get, this is a chapter 3 overview, and it focuses on politics and the history of, well, not the whole history, obviously, that would take a long time, but a summary, an overview of the history in the United States in regard to politics and the right to vote, who has been able to vote, who's been left out of voting, and some of the more current issues around voting. Hang on a minute, let me pause this. So let's start. A lot of it is about, first about the history in the 1950s and 60s. So I'm going to get right to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And one of the things that I want to show you is a video clip of a couple people trying to take the A literacy test. It was a literacy test that was used in Louisiana back in the, up until it was outlawed. And literacy tests, of course, were only given to blacks. They were not given to whites. But see what happens as they're trying to take this test. I think it's quite interesting. Hang on a second.
I am a very good test taker.
I'm a terrible test taker.
I think I'm a pretty fantastic test taker.
Why do they have a separate literacy test? I don't understand. Is it a racist thing?
This test is to be given to anyone who cannot prove a 5th grade education.
One wrong answer denotes failure of the test.
You have 10 minutes to complete this test.
Circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line.
Why are there 2 firsts?
In the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with the letter L.
Yeah, that's where I'm like,
What?
Why does my head hurt?
Cross out the number necessary when making the number below 1 million.
That doesn't make sense to me. This is a literacy quiz?
Draw a square with a triangle in it, and within that same triangle, draw a circle with a black dot. It's the Illuminati eye.
Spell backwards forwards.
I think we gotta move faster.
30 questions, oh God.
Killing this game.
3 minutes left. Fuck!
It's making me feel really competitive right now. Like we have to.
I'm dead. I'm just giving up. But
No, we're gonna do this.
Okay. This is hard. We got to question 25.
I would not be able to vote.
I wouldn't either.
Failed hardcore because I didn't even complete the test.
I know that this test was intentionally trying to trick me, and it succeeded, and that makes me really, really sad.
The efforts to go to make discrimination official, it blows my mind.
To be a black person, to have the right to vote, you had to literally get through fucking riddles.
It made me realize that I take voting for granted.
It makes me appreciate it more to be able to actually have the right to vote. Your duty almost as an American citizen to vote.
This is eye-opening to me in a different light because in Puerto Rico right now, we're a country of United States citizens, and because we're a territory, we can't vote.
I just think that we found new ways to suppress voting rights in certain states where there's only 3 or 4 places where you can register to vote, and they're miles and miles away from counties that have a predominantly poor demographic.
What makes me more upset is just knowing that there's no concrete answers. The person who is administering the test is the one who determines if it's right. Yeah, this just proves that black people should never.
Okay, so what you can see, of course, is that test was pretty difficult. I mean, you had to assert a set period of time, and the most disturbing thing, of course, is that the person who was giving you the test, administering the test, was the one who decided whether or not your answers were right. And there is a sample in the text. Let's see if I find it here. Well, I think I have it. That's right here. Hold on, maybe it's back here. Oh, there it is. Okay, so here's a sample of the test. You can take a look at it and the text when you have more time, and see how many of those you think you could have been able to get right. And again, keeping in mind that it really depended on who's administering the test, whether or not they decided you actually got these things right. So, you know, crazy, crazy, crazy. Civil Rights Act of 1964, very, very important piece of federal legislation back then and even now. It's used all the time. In particular, Title VII is the section that is most often used in cases whereby plaintiffs are alleging discrimination. And Title VII, Civil Rights Act of 1964 says that people cannot be, no individual can be discriminated against because of their race, their sex, their gender. Well, sex and gender, that wasn't in there, but we count it. Your nationality, where you're born, your religion, or your skin color. Okay, and so of course it is huge. It's a huge, huge piece of legislation. Without Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we probably would not have the kinds of rights that we have today, for sure. But just because this law is in place doesn't mean the discrimination doesn't still happen. Of course it does. Just because people don't any longer, they're not overt in their racism and their discrimination doesn't mean that it's not covertly occurring. And it's more difficult to prove, but when you look at statistics, when you look at numbers, then you really get a sense of, well, you know, could it really be that there aren't really any, and I'll give you a current example right now that's going on. This is February 2022. Earlier this past week, a former NFL head coach, Brian Flores, was fired from his job as a head coach, and he filed a lawsuit alleging that he and other Black individuals have been discriminated against within the NFL. Now, there might be somebody who says, well, you know, it's not about race. You guys just don't get hired. But consider this. Coaches typically have some experience with football. And considering the fact that the NFL is overwhelmingly players of color, particularly Black players of color, wouldn't it be odd to think that none of those players know enough or are smart enough, have the ability to think logically and rationally enough to be a head coach? Wouldn't that be really, really crazy to think that? And so one then has to ask the question, well, why aren't there more Black football coaches in the NFL? Why aren't there more Black coaches in the NBA? There's certainly lots of players, people who have played the game for years, who have learned strategy, etc., who seemingly could perhaps become coaches, and yet we see that overwhelmingly in the NBA, coaches also are overwhelmingly white. So just something, you know, to think about in terms of discrimination. Yes, it's illegal, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen anymore. Racism doesn't look the way it used to. It looks different today, but it's still around. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the following year, was passed by Congress and signed into law by Lyndon Johnson. And it banned those literacy tests that you just saw people trying to take a version of. It abolished poll taxes. Poll taxes were just that. If you wanted to vote, you paid a tax. If you couldn't pay the tax, you couldn't vote. And it established the entity that oversaw elections within southern states. And right now, we're dealing with something that is a result of a Supreme Court case. And if you hang on just a moment, be right back. I'm going to find that case. Hang on.
Mental decision by the Supreme Court.
Okay, so I found a news clip that discusses the 2013 U.S. Supreme Court decision, which struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. So take a look at this because it has repercussions right now. Go back a little bit.
By the Supreme Court changing the Voting Rights Act, the law of the land for 48 years. And they did it with a simple declaration about America, quote, "Our country has changed." They were talking about race and the protected right to vote. And this prompted a passionate argument all day long about race in America. And so we begin with ABC Supreme Court watcher Terry Moran. Terry.
Well, Diane, this, as you point out, is the biggest civil rights decision from this court in years. And it marks the end of an era, at least for now.
We have come to register to vote.
This is why the Voting Rights Act was passed. In some of the darkest days of American history, the act brought hope and action. It transformed American democracy. Today, Chief Justice John Roberts bluntly declared that times have changed and the law must too. History did not end in 1965, Roberts wrote in an opinion joined by his 4 fellow conservatives. The problem, the court held, is that the most powerful parts of the Voting Rights Act targeted only some areas of the country, singling out states and localities that had a proven history of voting discrimination in 1965. The federal government strictly supervised all elections in those areas. Congress renewed the law for 25 more years in 2006, but basically used the same old formula to determine which states and localities should be covered. And that, Chief Justice John Roberts declared, is unconstitutional. Congress must ensure that the law speaks to current conditions, he wrote. In a fierce dissent joined by 3 liberal justices, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg retorted, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Congressman John Lewis remembers the past. Lewis was savagely beaten as a young man marching for freedom in the South, and he learned of today's decision with ABC's Jeff Zeleny.
I think what the Supreme Court did was to put a dagger in the very heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This act helped liberate not just a people, but a nation.
But Lewis's white colleague, Republican Congressman Alan Nunnally of Mississippi, welcomed the ruling.
We should not be judged on the Mississippi of 50 or 60 years ago. I welcome the court recognizing that Mississippi has changed.
So now the question is, will the Congress pass a new Voting Rights Act for a new era? There's a lot of evidence that minority voters in many parts of the country still face obstacles to full participation in the democracy, but given the partisan mess across the street here, it's unlikely that such a thing will happen. And Diane, the change has already come. The Attorney General in Texas stating that a voter ID law that was declared discriminatory and illegal under this Voting Rights Act will now go into effect, thanks to the Supreme Court.
As we said, there's so much argument around this country today. Thank you so much, Terry.
Okay, so hang on to my camera here. Okay, so as you could see in that clip, hang on. There we go, back. As you could see in that clip, that one section, Section 4, which meant that anytime a southern state, because that's where it was in the southern and the Midwest states that had this history of discriminating against voters, anytime they wanted to implement new voting rules or laws in the state, they'd have to send the proposed law to that federal entity that was overseeing these elections in these states, and it had to pass, constitutionality according to their view of the law. And if it didn't pass their muster, then they couldn't implement it. And you saw in that video clip that Texas, which tried to implement a law that would have required voter ID laws, the voter IDs. In order to vote, you have to show your ID. California, by the way, does not do that. You do not have to show your, you're not required to show your ID when you go to vote in California. And every time I say that, there are always 1 or 2 students who say, that happened to my mom, it happened to my dad, or happened to me. I went to vote and I was told I need to see your ID. And luckily I had it, so I showed it to him, and I said, but you're not required to do that. And I've been asked to show my ID, and I have to educate poll workers. You cannot ask me that. And they call the supervisor over, and I tell them, that's not California law. You can call your supervisor, and then, but I don't show my ID because I don't have to. And I'm not going to do something just because somebody who's ill-informed is telling me that I have to do it. So anyway, as a result, quite a few states have passed laws that probably would have not, and these are in the South and the Midwest, that probably would not have passed constitutional muster under Section 4. But since 2013, it's been, when it was struck down, lots of changes have been made. In fact, since this last election in November 2020, states have begun to make even more restrictive laws. Texas, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, etc. Some of the most ridiculous, I think, maybe you'll agree with me, maybe not, but one of the most ridiculous ones that I've heard is that if people are waiting in line and you are a do-gooder, you're a good Samaritan, and it's, hot day, or, you just feel like being kind to other humans, and you want to go out there and maybe give a snack or a bottle of water, a granola bar, packaged granola bar and a bottle of water, or just even a bottle of water, that would be a misdemeanor. That would be a misdemeanor. Okay. Not an infraction. Not an infraction. It would be a misdemeanor. Okay. Now, the reasoning for this law, I don't understand it. I have not heard anyone say why this is a bad idea or why it's a good idea to make it a misdemeanor for someone to give another person standing in line, perhaps on a hot day, or just because they're standing in line for a long time, a bottle of water. Why that would be a misdemeanor makes no sense to me. But in some states, that's the new law. You give somebody a bottle of water or a packaged snack, that's a misdemeanor. The only thing I can think of is why it seems like a good idea to some people in southern states who have power is, well, if people are in line for a long time, they might get thirsty or hungry, and if there's nobody there to give them a bottle of water or a snack, they might leave the line and go get something and then decide, I'm not going to go stand back in line again because I'm going to have to get back at the end of the line. That's the only thing I can think of. But then you're doing that because you want to make it more difficult for people to vote. So anyway, lots of things. Let me go to the Southern strategy, because this is something that started in the late 1960s with Richard Nixon's campaign and has continued through to what we see today. If you may not know this, and this you will learn in this chapter, at one time the South was actually Democratic. They were Democrats. And remember, Lyndon Johnson was from Texas. He's the guy who took over after John Kennedy was assassinated. He was from the South. He was a Democrat. Okay? But Johnson was a different kind of Southerner. He had grown up in Texas, and I know a little bit about this because I went to his library and spent some time there and learned about his early life. He grew up poor and made his way to college, etc. But one of his first jobs was teaching brown kids in a small town in Texas. And he came to understand that these kids were just as intelligent as any other kids, but that they did have some obstacles. Sometimes their families moved because their families often were agricultural workers, and so they moved from crop to crop, from parts of the state to the parts of the state. So their education was often interrupted by moving with their families, or because they needed to work in the fields, they might not come to work for a few days or school for a few days, etc. But he really saw for himself that young brown kids have a lot of potential, and he carried that with him apparently, and remembered, himself being poor. And so when he started his career in politics, he really strongly believed that it was government's role to try to improve the lives of its people. And to that end, he had this idea of implementing laws that would create what he called a great society. And so while Roosevelt's known for his New Deal plan, Johnson is known for his Great Society plan. And so a lot of the legislation that came out of the 1960s, Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, etc. A lot of these laws came out of a push from Lyndon Johnson to Democratic lawmakers. Let's get this stuff done. And indeed, a lot was done during that time. Of course, you know, if you know anything about history, his legacy was tarnished because of Vietnam. But having said that, Head Start was a part of his Great Society plan. TANF, well, it was food stamps, but now we call it TANF. SNAP, which at one time was just called welfare, but now it's called supplemental nutrition to assist needy families. All of these things were part of the 1960s. Now, of course, these policies helped poor people of color quite a bit. They helped poor whites too. But remember what I said in earlier in chapter 2, that poor whites don't look at themselves as being similar to poor people of color. In their view, they're still superior because even though they're poor, at least they're white. And so poor whites started looking at this, and of course, people with money who were Democrats in the South were looking at this and not happy with it. And so what Nixon really was good at doing was tapping into the anger and the frustration that Southern whites felt at the Democrats for implementing all these Great Society policies and laws, and getting them to switch sides and become Republicans. And that's where we see, it's during the late 1960s and Nixon's campaign, where we see the change from the South being largely Democratic to largely Republican. And there's this Southern strategy includes not just tapping into that anger and frustration that poor whites and other whites are feeling, because now people of color are starting to get some equal footing, starting to at least get some ground to step on as opposed to hanging off the cliff. There's a lot of this coded language that's being used as well. So things such as, you know, it's states' rights, right? Not the federal government. The federal government shouldn't be doing these things. States should be deciding for themselves what kinds of laws they want to have. The federal government should be coming in here and telling us we have to do this, we have to do that. Also talking about things such as, you know, welfare queens. Again, the idea being these are black women who have all these children who don't really deserve to be given a handout from the government. All of these ideas of them versus us. And effectively, Nixon draws those white voters, and he wins in 1968 quite handily. He wins again quite handily in 1972. And since then, the South has been largely Republican. But it is interesting because most people don't really realize that at one point the South was Democratic. They were all Democrats. Of course, for the Democratic Party, some good news. A lot of non-whites are Democrats. And since the U.S. is becoming much more diverse, a lot more various groups in the United States, that's good for the Democrats. The difficulty, though, of course, is not only getting people to the polls to vote, but also ensuring that as many people who are eligible to become citizens become citizens. That is also a huge task for the Democratic Party. Again, assuming that they want to, you know, have some power. Let's see. Superficial representation. This is the idea that there's a lot of different skin colors, you know, lots of different groups that are present, but there's not really much diversity within the political discourse in terms of who's getting elected to office, who is proposing laws, getting them passed, and getting them signed into law. Yes, we've got a lot of diversity in the United States, but if you look at the percentage of people of color, say, well, here's a quick statistic. California, very large state, huge population. I think last I heard it was around 40 million people living in California. When Kamala Harris was chosen by Joe Biden as his running mate and they won and she became VP, of course she had to step down from the Senate position representing California. Gavin Newsom then had the task of appointing someone to fill the remainder of her term. And he did. He appointed Alex Padilla. Now, Alex Padilla is the first brown senator to represent California. Why has it taken this long, all the way into the 21st century, when California has always had lots of brown people? Well, part of the answer lies in the fact that two white women have represented California since the early 1990s, Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer. Now, Barbara Boxer did step down finally about, 4 or 5 years ago, and that's when Kamala Harris ran and took over that seat. But Dianne Feinstein, 87, 88 years old, she's still representing California. Why not let other people, take a seat at the table? That's a question I always have. I think it's really important for younger people, more diverse people, to take over leadership roles with not only within Congress and the House of Representatives and Senate, but also at the state and local levels too. So I encourage you all to think at some point about running for something, whether it's your school board or your city council, something, because we need people who come with diverse experiences to represent us. All right, so gerrymandering, that's something that's mentioned in that video clip. I want to go over this. Gerrymandering is something that is illegal, but it continues frequently. It's drawing districts in such a way that you can almost ensure that somebody from one party or another is going to win. And if you take a look here, this is in Illinois. Look at how this district is drawn. I mean, it makes no sense. It looks like some kind of a Rorschach block. Wouldn't it make more sense to have the district just be like this, and then this be part of another district, this whole area? And same thing here. Look at this little crazy squiggly line here. Wouldn't it make more sense to perhaps this is one big district, or it's part of this here? These are drawn so that it's fairly certain that a Democrat's going to win in this district, or a Republican. Same thing here. It is illegal, but it continues to happen. And, states have very different laws as well in terms of how people can go out and try to get people to be registered. I've read a really good book about politics and voting rights. And one of the things that I learned is that, for example, in Texas, if you want to go out and register voters, you have to be certain that you know exactly what the district map is, because if you go one block too far over, then that is a violation. And if somebody reports you, that is a felony. And you think, well, but shouldn't it be a good thing? Shouldn't you not have to worry if you're looking at a district like this and you go one block over? Shouldn't you not have to worry about committing a felony? You're trying to do a good thing. You're trying to get people to register to vote. You're not trying to tell them how to vote. You're just trying to get them registered to vote. Again, fortunately, in California, we don't have these crazy, you guys don't have these crazy laws, but some of these southern states do. All right. Let's see. Okay, here's an interesting thing. that's discussed in the book. It's called the principal implementation gap, meaning that people say one thing, but when it comes time to do something that would support what they say they believe, there's a gap there. Okay? And so here are several examples of what people say they believe in, but they're actually against laws that would help to foster what they say they believe in. So one of those is, if you ask almost any white person, hey, are you, do you disapprove of discrimination? Do you think discrimination shouldn't occur in housing and the workplace and in education? Most of them will say, of course, discrimination's terrible, it's wrong. But then if you ask them, well, what about this federal program that would combat some of that happening? Well, I don't think we should give more funding to that. We should be funding this instead. Or you ask them, what about poverty? Do you think poverty is a bad thing? Oh, of course, poverty is terrible. When it comes to giving money to federal programs that would help combat poverty, oh, no. People just need to get a job. They need to work. They need to be like the rest of us and, just get off their lazy asses and go and work. It seems that people are really good at supporting ideas, but not so good at supporting the policies or the programs that would actually help to reduce or combat that problem. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And here's one of the problems with voter ID requirements. There are at least in 24 states, but actually probably more now, since November 2020. But not everybody has an ID. You might think to yourself, well, geez, how could some people not have an ID? I have an ID. I have a student ID. I have a driver's license. How could somebody not have an ID? Well, what you might not realize is that if you're homeless, you may not have an ID. Why? Well, because the one you had expired. Say your driver's license, that expired, and since you're homeless, you didn't have any money, so you didn't go renew it. And if you're not a student and you don't have a job, you don't have an ID. And you think, well, wait a minute. What about other people? Well, consider, if you're somebody who's low income, you might not have an ID, because not only does an ID cost money, but you don't really need an ID to buy a bus pass. You don't need an ID to have your Social Security check go directly into a checking account. And if you live with family members and you're poor, you might not have an ID simply because you don't really need one. You're not cashing checks. You are not buying phones or getting credit cards. You might not have one. I know it's hard to believe, but there are actually people who do not have IDs. And remember that for some people, it sounds like maybe not so much. Like, I don't know what the price of replacing a lost license is, in California, but let's say it's $20. $20 is a lot of money to somebody who's living, essentially from, Social Security check to Social Security check, or unemployment check to unemployment check. That $20 could buy groceries. And so if you don't really need an ID except to vote, then, maybe you just don't spend the $20 or whatever it might be to go get an ID. Felon disenfranchisement is another big issue. In some states, you cannot vote because you have a felony conviction. Okay, and so here's the interesting thing. If you're in prison, of course, we all know there's no state that allows people to vote while they're in prison. I don't think. If you're on parole, in most states, you still can't vote. Once you finish parole, okay, now you paid your debt to society, there are some states where you still can't vote. Even though you were convicted, you served your time, you served your parole, you still can't vote. You see there the statistic about 1 in every 40 people who should be eligible to vote can't because of a prior felony conviction. And remember, we're not talking about people who are currently in prison or on parole. We're talking about people who no longer have any of those issues going on, okay, no matter how long it's been, which to me seems really, really crazy. I thought we wanted people to reintegrate into our communities, not to prevent them from having the rights that the rest of us have. All right, so I think I'm going to leave it there because you can take a look at some of these other things in the chapter, and I'll see you for chapter 4.